Hey everyone, my name is Marilyn. I'm 50 years old, and today I want to tell you a story that changed my life forever. It's not just a story about loss, it's about truth, betrayal, and a mystery that began at the most unexpected place, my husband's funeral. I had been married to David for over 20 years. He was my partner, my confidant, the man I thought I would grow old with. His sudden death shattered me. They told me it was a heart attack, a silent, cruel thief of life. But as I stood by his casket that cold afternoon, surrounded by family and friends dressed in black, something happened that turned my grief into suspicion. A stranger, someone I had never seen before, slipped through the crowd. Their face was calm, almost too calm, as they pressed a folded note into my hand. I remember the way my fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The ink smudged slightly as though written in haste. 5 words were written inside, and they shook me to my core. He was murdered. Ask why. In that moment, the world tilted. My sorrow twisted into questions. Who was the stranger? Why give me this message now? And most importantly, what really happened to my husband? This is the story of how I went from widow to seeker of truth, piecing together the shadows of David's last days, uncovering secrets I never imagined were hidden in the life we shared. So sit with me as I take you through the journey I never asked for but could never walk away from. And if this story touches you, please subscribe, like, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. The note felt heavier than the casket in front of me. I tucked it into the sleeve of my black dress, afraid someone would see, afraid someone might ask what I was holding. For the rest of that funeral, I heard no words, saw no faces, just the echo of those 5 haunting words looping inside my head. He was murdered. Ask why. The service ended, condolences blurred into muffled sounds. The service ended, condolences blurred into muffled sounds. Condolences blurred into muffled sounds, and hands touched my arm as though I were made of glass. But beneath my grief was a fire that had been lit, burning hotter with each passing second. When the last mourner left and the air outside smelled of damp earth and fading lily, I finally allowed myself to look again at the note, as if the words might have changed. They hadn't. They sat there, unyielding, demanding I not ignore them. David had died 3 weeks earlier, suddenly, while driving home from work. They told me he lost control. His car swerved into a ditch, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. The coroner's report said it was a cardiac arrest that caused him to lose consciousness. Everyone accepted it. Everyone except, it seemed, the stranger who had dared to interrupt his funeral. That night, long after the house emptied, I sat in our bedroom with his jacket draped across my lap, searching the pockets like a desperate woman might search for a key to another world. Receipts, a pen, a pack of gum, nothing unusual. Yet now, every ordinary detail felt suspicious. Was I missing something? Was there something I was never meant to find? For days after the funeral, I replayed our last conversations, looking for hidden meaning. I remembered how tired he had seemed in those final weeks, his eyes shadowed, his hands restless. He'd said it was just stress from work, the new project keeping him late at the office. But now those excuses echoed differently, as if they were rehearsed lines meant to hide something else. I thought about the night before he died, how he lingered at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, then looked at me and said, "Marilyn, promise me something. If anything ever happens to me, don't just believe the first thing they tell you." At the time, I brushed it off as one of those odd, dramatic things people say when they're tired. But now, in light of the note, it felt like a warning. I needed to know who the stranger was. I asked around quietly, calling relatives, asking if anyone had noticed a tall man in a gray coat at the service. Some said no, others shrugged, One cousin vaguely recalled someone like that standing near the back, but couldn't place a name. I considered going to the police with the note, but what could I say? That someone handed me a scrap of paper at a funeral? They would laugh, or worse, tell me to grieve properly and stop imagining things. I wasn't ready for their dismissal. Instead, I began with David's office. He worked for an engineering firm downtown, a place filled with cubicles and fluorescent lights. When I walked in, carrying a tin of cookies as though I were just a grieving widow stopping by, people offered polite smiles and sympathetic looks. I asked to see his desk, claiming I wanted to gather his personal things. The receptionist hesitated, but eventually relented. There, among pens, paper clips, and old coffee mugs, I found files neatly stacked, each labeled with project names I barely recognized. But one file was missing: Project Helios, a name David had mentioned more than once at dinner. The absence struck me immediately. When I asked his coworker, a nervous man named Peter, about it, his face paled. That project was reassigned, he muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. Maybe the files with the new team. His tone was too sharp, too defensive. I pressed him gently, but he shook his head, mumbling an excuse before hurrying away. The more questions I asked, the more doors seemed to close. It was as if the entire office had been warned not to speak. That night, I returned home with David's belongings, but his absence was louder than the silence of the house. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and opened the drawer of his desk where he kept personal papers. Among the bills and old letters, I found a small notebook. Most of the pages were blank, but tucked in the middle was a page with hurried notes scribbled across it. Numbers, dates, and a single phrase underlined twice. They know. The words froze me. Who were they? And what did they know? Sleep became impossible. Each night I tossed and turned, haunted not only by my grief, but by the shadows of secrets I couldn't yet name. During the day, I tried to maintain normalcy, smiling when friends dropped off casseroles, pretending to be strong for the children, but inside I was unraveling. I began to notice strange things: the car that seemed to idle a little too long across the street, the anonymous call where no one spoke on the other end. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe just the raw edge of mourning, but maybe it was something else. Weeks later, I returned to the cemetery. The grass had grown back where the soil had been freshly turned. I stood there, speaking softly to the stone, when I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there he was, the same man who had handed me the note. His coat was darker this time, his face partially hidden by a scarf. My pulse raced as I whispered, "Why? Why did you write that?" He looked at me, his eyes carrying a weight I couldn't decipher, and said only, "He trusted the wrong people." And they silenced him. Then, just as quickly, he walked away, blending into the trees before I could even think to follow. From that moment, I knew two things. My husband's death was no accident, and I could not let his story be buried with him. The moment the man disappeared into the trees, I stood frozen, my breath misting in the cold air. I wanted to run after him, to demand more answers, but my body wouldn't move. His words echoed like thunder. He trusted the wrong people. And they silenced him. It was the confirmation I had both dreaded and needed. David hadn't just died. Someone had ensured he wouldn't live to tell me whatever he had been carrying. And now, by reaching out to me, this stranger had placed me in the orbit of that same danger. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I spread out everything I had gathered across the dining room table, the note from the funeral, David's notebook with the cryptic phrase, "They know," and the empty space where Project Helios should have been. I lit a candle as if the flame could illuminate not only the paper before me, but the truth hidden within it. I thought of David's last warning: don't just believe the first thing they tell you. My chest tightened. He must have known something was coming. He must have feared it. and now I was left holding the fragments. I decided the next step was to learn what Project Helios really was. At dawn, I returned to David's office building. This time I didn't bother with polite smiles or excuses. I went straight to the security guard, a weary-looking man who seemed too tired to care. "I need to see the archives," I said with as much authority as I could muster. He glanced at me, hesitated, but perhaps pity or indifference won out, because he handed me a visitor's badge and waved me through. The archives were a maze of metal filing cabinets and cardboard boxes, the air thick with dust. My fingers trailed across labels until I found a drawer marked with the letter H. My heart pounded as I slid it open. Inside were folders, each neatly tagged Helix, Henderson, Heritage, but no Helios. It wasn't misfiled. It was gone. And not just gone, deliberately erased. Someone had removed it entirely, leaving no trace behind. Frustration welled in me. But just as I turned to leave, I noticed a slip of paper wedged deep inside the drawer, as though it had been missed. Pulling it free, I found it was a photocopy of a project expense sheet. The header read Helios Development Phase 2. My breath caught. Under the columns of numbers and dates, several entries had been blacked out with thick marker, but one line was still visible. A payment to an offshore account under a name. I didn't recognize Cadden Industries. I slipped the paper into my purse, adrenaline surging. Whoever had erased Helios from existence hadn't been thorough enough. But as I walked back to my car, I felt eyes on me. A man in a dark sedan parked across the street stared too long before looking away. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe the closer I got, the more dangerous this became. Back at home, I began to dig. Cadden Industries, as far as I could find through late-night internet searches, was a shell company tied to no physical address, no legitimate business. It existed only in documents, like a shadow in financial ledgers. I traced it through a trail of subsidiaries until the connections grew too convoluted for me to follow. Whoever built this web wanted it that way. Yet, in the margins of my search, I stumbled upon an old news article. Buried in a business column, it mentioned that Cadden Industries had once been linked to government defense contracts, specifically experimental energy systems. The phrase lodged in my mind like a shard of glass. Experimental energy systems. What kind of project had David been involved in? And why would knowledge of it be worth killing for? The deeper I searched, the more I felt David's presence beside me, urging me forward. I remembered how he used to stay up late, reading technical manuals, his desk lamp casting a halo around him. He had been passionate, dedicated, but he had also grown more withdrawn in those final weeks. Maybe he'd realized the danger too late. Maybe he had been trying to protect me by staying silent. One evening, as I sat with the notebook again, I noticed something I had overlooked. The page with the phrase, "they know," also had faint indentations from where another page had been torn out. I held it under the lamp, shading the paper with a pencil until the grooves revealed a partial message. Letters emerged slowly, painfully. Meet at the docks. Midnight. My pulse quickened. Could it have been a meeting David had planned before his death? With whom? With whom? I drove to the docks the next night, the salt air biting at my skin. The place was deserted, the water slapping against wood in an eerie rhythm. I walked past rusting containers and flickering lamps, half expecting nothing, half dreading what I might find. Then I heard a footstep behind me. I spun, and there, stepping from the shadows, was the stranger again. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Then tell me why," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Tell me why my husband is dead. Tell me what Project Helios is." He hesitated, his eyes scanning the darkness around us as if the night itself could be listening. Finally, he said, "Helios was never just engineering. It was a weapon, Your husband found out what it would do if it ever became operational. He tried to stop it. My breath hitched. A weapon. Not an energy system, not just science. A weapon hidden under the guise of innovation. And they killed him for that? I whispered. He nodded grimly. David was loyal, but he wasn't blind. He started asking questions. Too many questions. They couldn't let him walk away. Tears stung my eyes as rage twisted inside me. Who are they? The man's jaw tightened. The kind of people who erase projects, who erase lives. People you can't fight directly. But if you want to finish what he started, you'll need proof. And proof is dangerous. Before I could ask more, headlights swept across the docks. The man cursed under his breath and shoved a small envelope into my hands. Take this. Don't come back here. They're watching you already. Then he vanished into the shadows once more, leaving me alone as the car rolled slowly past. Its windows too tinted to see inside. I drove home trembling, clutching the envelope as if it were my lifeline. Inside were photocopies emails between David and someone named R. In them, David warned of catastrophic consequences if Helios moved forward. The responses were brief, cryptic, but one line stood out. They will bury you if you speak. Protect your family. That night I sat in the dark with the envelope on my lap, torn between fear and determination. Whoever these people were, they had silenced David, but I still had a voice. And as the candle flickered beside me, I knew that voice would not remain quiet. Not until the truth was brought into the light. The envelope sat on my lap like a burning coal, its weight far heavier than paper should allow. I read the emails over and over, each word slicing deeper, confirming what I already feared. David had been silenced for knowing too much. My hands trembled, my mind racing between grief and fury. I thought of his tired eyes in those final weeks, of how he must have carried the burden of truth alone, unable to share it with me for fear of putting me in danger. And now here I was, standing at the edge of the same darkness that swallowed him. For days I couldn't decide what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to protect myself, to bury the evidence and pretend I had never seen it. But every time I looked at his photograph on the mantel, David's steady smile, the warmth in his eyes, I knew silence would be the final betrayal. He had trusted me enough to leave behind fragments, to leave behind warnings. If I didn't pursue them, then he would have died for nothing. I began quietly. I copied the emails and hid the originals in a lockbox at a bank across town. I told no one, not even my closest friend. I knew the walls had ears now, that my phone could be listened to, that my home might not even be safe. At night, I unplugged the lamps and sat in the dark, watching the shadows outside the window shift. Sometimes a car idled too long at the curb. Sometimes a figure lingered across the street. Fear became a constant companion, but so did resolve. I needed to know who R was, the person David had been corresponding with. The emails were signed only with the initial, but one included a timestamp and location metadata that hadn't been scrubbed clean. It pointed to a government building on the edge of town, an anonymous facility that I had driven past 100 times without noticing. The thought of walking into that building terrified me, but I couldn't let it go. The next morning, I dressed plainly, tied my hair back, and walked into the facility as though I belonged there. The receptionist glanced at me, distracted by her phone, and I slipped past into a hallway. The place smelled of bleach and metal, the kind of sterile environment where secrets hide in plain sight. I wandered cautiously until I reached a door marked restricted access. As I stood there, debating whether to risk opening it, a man's voice startled me. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I turned and froze. It was him again, the stranger. His face was weary now, his eyes sharp with warning. "You've been following me," I said, my voice shaking between accusation and relief. "I've been protecting you," he replied flatly. "You have no idea how close you are to the fire." "Then tell me everything," I demanded. "No more fragments. No more hints. Who killed my husband? Who are they?" He looked at me for a long moment, as though weighing whether I was strong enough to bear the truth. Then he said, "Helios isn't just a weapon, it's a destabilization system. If it's completed, it could cripple entire cities in seconds. Your husband discovered they were preparing to sell it to private buyers, people who'd use it for power, for control. He tried to stop them. That's why he's gone." I staggered against the wall, bile rising in my throat. It was worse than I'd imagined, not just corruption, but treachery at the highest level. My husband had died because he refused to be complicit in a weapon that could devastate millions. And R? I asked Dot. The stranger's jaw tightened. R is a whistleblower on the inside. They trusted your husband, but now you're all that's left. If you want justice, you need to find them. But once you do, there's no turning back. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. The stranger grabbed my arm and pulled me into a stairwell. "Go home," he hissed. "Burn the copies. Forget Helios. If you keep digging, they will come for you." He disappeared again, leaving me trembling in the shadows, but I didn't burn the copies. I couldn't. Instead, I searched for R. I scoured employee directories, government records, public archives, until finally I found a match. Richard Hawley, a mid-level project analyst who had vanished from public record 2 years ago. No social media, no address, nothing. It was as if he'd been erased. But buried deep in an online forum, I found a clue: an anonymous user named R, posting warnings about energy, corruption, and systems of collapse. The post stopped. Suddenly, 6 months ago. I followed the trail to an abandoned apartment complex downtown. Dust and silence filled the halls. But one door bore faint signs of life, a lock recently broken, a few food wrappers on the floor. Inside, I found scattered papers, diagrams, and notes scrawled with paranoia. On the wall, written in bold letters, was a single phrase: "If I disappear, Helios is real." As I sifted through the debris, I heard a floorboard creak. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned and found myself face to face with a gaunt man, his eyes sunken but burning with intensity. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped. "Are you Richard?" I asked, my voice barely audible. His gaze darted around the room. "I don't use that name anymore." "It's not safe." I stepped closer. "David was my husband. He trusted you. He died because of this." For the first time, the man's hardened expression cracked. Pain flickered across his face. "I told him they'd come for him. I told him to run. Then help me," I pleaded. "Don't let his death mean nothing." He hesitated, then motioned me to sit. In a trembling voice, he explained everything. Helios was designed as an electromagnetic disruptor, capable of knocking out infrastructure, power grids, communications, even medical systems across entire regions. Officially, it was a defense system, but in reality, it was a tool for control, a weapon too dangerous to exist. David had discovered that it was already being tested in secret locations, and worse, that it was being prepared for sale to foreign powers. He had tried to expose it, but someone inside the chain silenced him. Richard slid a folder across the table. "These are the last documents I saved before I went underground. If you release them, the world will know. But if you do, you'll have no protection. They'll come for you next." I opened the folder and felt the weight of truth in my hands. Technical schematics, payment trails, names of companies, signatures of officials, it was all there. Proof undeniable. Proof that could topple powerful people. Proof that had cost my husband his life. For hours after I left that apartment, I drove aimlessly, the folder beside me like a ticking bomb. Every choice ahead was dangerous. If I stayed silent, I was complicit. If I spoke, I risked everything. I thought of my children, of the life David and I had built, of the quiet evenings that would never return. And I thought of his voice the night before he died. If anything happens to me, don't just believe the first thing they tell you. In the end, the decision wasn't mine. It was his. He had trusted me with this burden, and I could not let him down. I contacted a journalist I had once met through a friend. Someone with a reputation for exposing corruption. We met in a dimly lit diner, the rain streaking down the windows, the world outside muffled and gray. I slid the folder across the table. The journalist opened it, eyes widening as he read. "If this is real," he whispered, "it will change everything." "It's real," I said firmly. And my husband died for it. The days that followed blurred into chaos. Articles broke. Headlines screamed about Helios, about covert weapons, about betrayal from within. Officials denied everything, but the documents spread faster than they could contain them. Protests erupted, investigations launched. For the first time, the silence began to crack, but with truth came danger. My phone rang with threats. Strange cars followed me through the city. One night, a brick shattered my window with a note tied to it. "Stop, or you'll join him." Fear pressed against me, but I refused to bend. Because every time I faltered, I remembered David's face, his quiet strength, his unspoken plea for justice. Months later, I stood once again at his grave. The world had changed because of him. Helios was dismantled, its architects exposed. But the cost was written in stone before me. I knelt, pressing my hand to the cold earth, and whispered, "I kept my promise." They didn't bury your truth with you. The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it a stillness that felt like peace. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to breathe not with relief, but with the fragile strength of someone who has walked through fire and survived. And though my life would never return to what it had been, I knew one thing with certainty. David had not died in vain. His voice still lived in the documents, in the headlines, in the ripples of change, and in me, the widow who refused to stay silent.